following the very large and very successful protest at the Scottish Parliament last week about the Gender Recognition Act reform and the sexualisation of children in schools, the national newspaper has decided it's time for another swipe at the Scottish Family Party, and who better to turn to help them with that than John Naples Campbell. Here he is.
It's the Proud Scotland Awards this weekend, and I thought I'd make myself look beautiful, and I meant to look like the Little Mermaid. I look nothing like her. I'm actually raging. I don't even know what this flappy thing is here. How am I meant to look?
So a little bit of background about John Naples Campbell. Here's a picture of him in what appears to be his natural habitat in a school, wearing obviously LGBT t-shirt. John was a drama teacher, deputy head teacher. I understand apparently he's not teaching at the moment, but that's been his careers in Scottish education. He's not averse to a bit of publicity. Here's an article in the Daily Record. Scots teacher who shed 10 stone after a gastric band operation tells how he still thinks he's overweight in his head. Here's his Twitter profile, and it says that he's got some sort of role with the General Teaching Council of Scotland to do with LGBT education. And when I had my case with the General Teaching Council of Scotland, when they were considering whether or not to strike me off for saying that children need a mum and a dad, ideally, when they didn't strike me off, John Naples Campbell described their decision as utterly heartbreaking. Now, there's another member of the Scottish Family Party as well, who's also got a GTCS case on the go at the moment. And John Naples Campbell was one of the people on social media at the forefront of basically reporting this lady to GTCS over Twitter. And he is sort of a representative of GTCS. Now, I'm still a member of GTCS, as it happens, a non-teaching member. I assume John is a member as well. But John's a different sort of member than me. He's a member at the core of the organisation. I'm one at the periphery, hanging on by my fingernails, treated with huge hostility. Anyway, let's see what John's had to say. Here we go then. Award-winning teacher opens up on harassment over support for LGBT plus education. What a headline. So this brave teacher has spoken up. Let's see what he's got to say. I was petrified to leave work in case I was going to get stabbed or acid chucked in my face. I know that sounds really dramatic, but you don't know what they're capable of. They knew where I worked. I was easily targeted. Well, does that sound dramatic? It sounds melodramatic to me. John Naples Campbell was a drama teacher. Right, is there any justification for this? Since he's worried about being stabbed, acid thrown in his face, with any threats of anything like that? Any sort of physical violence towards him? As far as I can tell, there's no mentions of anything like that. But I guess in journalism school, you're taught you need a really hard-hitting opening paragraph to get people's interest. Whether or not the rest of the article backs it up or not, you've got to start with something really, really dramatic. And he's certainly done that. The harassment of John Naples Campbell didn't begin with a hateful card sent to him on his birthday, but that was when it crossed over from the online world to real life. Now, okay, if you're online with controversial issues, there are always going to be people who are going to be obnoxious and insulting, foul-mouthed, etc. That's just, unfortunately, par for the course for places like Twitter. We get more than our fair share of that. Perhaps, I'm sure John Naples Campbell has received some unpleasant comments as well over that. The fact that it crossed over to him getting a card through the post, again, we've had dozens of such things, pretty unsavory, also objects sent through the post. But anyway, I mean, this sort of thing will happen. I mean, there's some people out there who are not very pleasant. Some people also, have to say, there's some degree who are unbalanced as well. So this card said, F off, you big poofter. Our kids don't need a shirt lifter around them, the card read. And it was not the last. Instead, it marked the start of a vicious campaign which has seen him hounded out of teaching and the police step in. That card, obviously, no wish to defend it at all. People shouldn't send things like that. Obviously, it's counterproductive. We wouldn't dream of doing something like that. But it happens. If you take a stand in a public way on an issue, it's going to happen. That's something that's going to happen. And it says, it's seen him hounded out of teaching and the police step in. I'm not sure how he's been hounded out of teaching, because what John Naples Campbell is doing in schools is implementing the government's policy. So if he's been hounded out of teaching by a few cards through the post, a bit of nastiness on social media, to be honest, I'm not sure that story adds up to me. And also think about it this way. If he's really fearing being stabbed and having acid thrown in his face, so he really daren't go to school, but he's happy to have an article with a huge picture of himself in the National making the same sort of points that allegedly are drawing these threats towards him. It doesn't really add up, does it? The police to step in, I mean, no doubt he did report it to the police as a hate incident or whatever, but I'm not sure I really see any crimes here. Right, he goes on. The anxiety is still there, Naples Campbell told the Sunday National. And it's not going back into the classroom. I know I could go back into the classroom tomorrow and be a good teacher. It's if this will happen again and how I will cope. John Naples Campbell is an award-winning educator who was involved in the successful push to see Scotland become the first country in the world to embed LGBT inclusive education across the curriculum. He's very definitely been a public campaigner and behind the tie campaign, etc. There's now got LGBT indoctrination in every subject from nursery right the way through all levels of Scottish schooling. But he's seen a backlash among elements of Scottish society. Backlash, in other words, opposition, counter-argument, might be another way of putting it, who claim that teachers are paedophiles or groomers looking to indoctrinate children into LGBT ideology. Now, let's go through those things one at a time, because that's quite a big feature in the article. Indoctrinate children into LGBT ideology. A huge number of teachers in Scotland are guilty as charged of that because they are implementing the government's policy. The government is guilty of wanting children indoctrinating into a specific ideology of LGBT issues, and a lot of teachers are going along with that. So guilty as charged, in my view. That's not offensive to suggest either. That's just a perfectly straightforward expression of an opinion. Now, people who've called him a paedophile, well, that's just wrong. People shouldn't do that. You shouldn't call someone a paedophile unless you've got evidence that they are personally a paedophile. Having said that, the Scottish government's curriculum, it does break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality. It does teach children that they've got a right to have illegal underage sex. It does present the message that sexuality, could be entered into at any age, that consent is the only thing that matters. So as long as the people consent, it's okay. Then I think we've got a problem with that, and that does open the door to sexual relationships with children. In terms of groomer, I don't use the word groomer myself in this context because I think a groomer is normally associated with someone who is preparing a child to have sex with themselves. But other people use the word groomer in the context of a person who is preparing young people to have sex as young people, preparing children to enter into sexual activity or leading them or opening them up to the possibility of sexual activity while they're very young. I think that use of it could be applied to sex education in Scotland, and therefore could be applied to the people who are teaching it in many cases. That would be that's just logical. If you disagree with the policy, then the people who are implementing it, you'll also disagree with what they're doing as well. Now, what the National, of course, is not going to do in the slightest is actually start analysing these issues and looking at the issue at the heart of the matter about the sex, sexuality and gender education in Scotland. Because in the progressive mindset, you don't try and grapple with the intellectual issue. Instead, you just try and work out who's nice and who's not nice, who's offended and who's not offended. That's the real story, so they think. And this article is entirely along those lines. Anyway, let us continue. Protesters variously against sex education. Not true. The protest outside the Parliament was not against sex education. It was against vulgar and corrupting sex education. Gender recognition act reform, the SNP, and COVID vaccines. There's nothing about COVID vaccines at all. Demonstrated together outside the Scottish Parliament on Thursday. In a video captured by a national reporter, one person labelled LGBT counter-protesters all effing child molesters. You are effing pedos, they shouted, they referring to a single person. It was a lady. leading Green Minister Patrick Harvey to call for the police to get involved. Well, Patrick Harvey wasn't there. He was inside in First Minister's question time, so not quite sure what that happened. There was a little, like 10 seconds of video that showed a lady screaming those comments at the counter protectors. She was sort of way over at the fringe of our protest. I didn't know she was there. Was she representative of the protest or the speakers? Definitely not. I think sometimes in these situations, when you've got a single individual who's behaving in quite a bizarre or excessive way, if you were to get to know the individual, you might realise, that might explain a little bit more about it. So I think picking on the unusual behaviour of an individual, firstly, it's unrepresentative of the whole protest. The other thing is you might well be targeting someone who is vulnerable and has difficulties in their lives, shall we say, that's leading them to this very strange behaviour down there. Anyway, so the National obviously picks up on that. It ignores everything that's been said in all the speeches for an hour and a half and just picks up on that sort of one lady who I suggest might be a little unbalanced, I don't know, on the fringe of our protest. Anyway, for Naples Campbell, there's no doubt that protests such as Thursday's, which saw placards urging people to say no to the new school sex education in Scotland, are directly linked to the abuse he and his colleagues across the country are reporting. In other words, if you oppose the style of sex education in Scotland, you're contributing to abuse of teachers. It's ridiculous. In other words, criticise the government's education policy and you're encouraging hostility, aggression, harassment or whatever of teachers. Absolute nonsense. We're quite worried that we're heading back to Section 28, he says, referring to the Thatcher-era law banning the promotion of homosexuality in schools. To be honest, I don't want homosexuality promoted in schools. Absolutely not. The government should not have that as policy. Teachers should not be promoting homosexuality in schools. And the reason John Naples Campbell disagrees with that, I infer, is that he thinks teachers should be promoting homosexuality in schools, and we can infer that that is what he is doing as well. Right, what do we got next? A lot of staff are scared to continue the work that they're doing quite excellently in promoting equality and diversity in LGBT education over fear of being called paedophiles and groomers, scared to continue their work, scared to implement government policy. To be honest, basically I don't believe this. Quite a lot of the things claimed in this article, basically I don't believe them. If you're a sex education teacher in a school, you're just getting on with your job there, I can't imagine that you're going to be attracting any social media hostility, hate mail or whatever. I just can't imagine that's happening. Now, if you throw yourself into the fray on the issue on social media, then as is inevitable with social media discourse, you're going to get some horrible, unbalanced comments coming towards you. But this idea that the staff are in fear for their safety because they're implementing the government's policy, I really do not believe it. Right, what's next? I think it's become a lot more evident over the past couple of years through the rise of the voice of the far right. And it has a conspiracy theory element. They're infiltrating the schools, infiltrating the government, that you're a paedophile and you shouldn't be working with children, that you have an ulterior motive. That's not conspiracy theory. I mean, government policy written down in black and white, that's not a conspiracy theory. And government policy has indeed been influenced by LGBT activists. I don't know, infiltration is the right word, but they've captured the system. Let's put it that way. Rhetoric from groups such as the Scottish Family Party claims that sex education for children amounts to teachers and government positively promoting pornography. That's out of date, actually. We say endorsing pornography. The video that justified us saying promoting pornography, the government withdrew it. Well, they didn't withdraw it. It got removed from the internet. I don't think the government saw the light. Just the video wasn't available anymore. So we don't say that anymore. We say endorsing pornography. Presented as valid, some disturbing and dangerous sexual practices. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we say. And endorsing illegal underage sex. Yes, that's exactly what we say. Now, with the National, wouldn't you think a journalist would think, well, we need to discuss these issues. What are they? Why do you say that? What's the counter-argument? Not interested at all in that. All they're thinking is, that this is not, the Scottish Family Party has not been very nice by saying these things. And that's all we need to know. That's all we need to know. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's somehow or other they're just not being nice by saying that. Anyway, let's continue. The party's manifesto says they oppose the LGBT inclusive education programme that mandates the indoctrination of children into a radical ideology of sexuality. It claims that having LGBT content across the entire curriculum is intended to deprive parents of the option of withdrawing their child from it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely true. But Naples Campbell says this is not the case. He says that opponents of LGBT education accuse educators of grooming and indoctrination based on the teaching of anything that is not deemed normal. I mean, there's just no intellectual engagement at all. There's no counter-argument. It's pathetic. It's a pathetic level of well, debate's not the right word to use. There's no intelligent response to anything that was said. So it says there's a movement where people are really against teachers, and there are these lines where people think I'm a parent and it should be me teaching sex ed, he says. But LGBT education isn't about sex ed. It's about role models and seeing your life in the school curriculum. In other words, John Naples Campbell says, how dare some parents suggest they don't want their children to be indoctrinated into my LGBT ideology? How dare they? It's their duty, it's the state's duty to make sure my values are promoted to children. That's what he's basically saying. In terms of role models, that's for example, presenting transgender people as positive role models. Look at me, I changed gender, wasn't that fantastic? Let's celebrate my decision and let's look at what a wonderful life path it was. Okay, that's not neutral. That's just teaching people about transgender people. That is promoting an ideology, and that is exactly what John Naples Campbell wants to do, and that's exactly what he's been paid to do by the Scottish Government for many years in Scottish schools. Speaking previously to the Sunday National, a Scottish primary school teacher who asked not to be named for fear of being targeted said it was very worrying that anyone would seek to deprive children of comprehensive sex education. Okay, these people who might be depriving their children of vulgar and corrupting sex education, those people are also often known as parents. So she finds it very worrying that some parents don't want their children indoctrinating into the Scottish Government's ideology of sex, sexuality and gender. Well, we beg to differ. Now, to the credit, the National included quite a bit of my response in the article. So the Scottish Family Party's Richard Lucas said that the video clip of the lady on the fringe of our protest screaming and swearing was not representative of any of the groups or speakers involved. So, right, fair enough. Lucas further defended the use of the terms paedophile and groomer. Right, I think I might complain to the National about that, because I did not defend the use of the term paedophile. When they wrote to me, they didn't give me detail of the story. I didn't know who it was about. So they said, someone's been called a paedophile. A sex education teacher's been called a paedophile. And I responded saying, this is probably not justified and should not be asserted without evidence. In other words, you can't go around calling people paedophiles if you haven't got good reason for doing that. Then said, however, the current education system sexualizes children, endorses sexual activity at young ages, so can reasonably be seen as an element of a wider movement to blur the lines that should separate children from sexual activity. Some of the people promoting this wider movement are paedophiles. Right, and they've recorded that as me defending the use of the word paedophile. Right, I would disagree with that, so I think I might complain, see if they will retract that. He added that it's typical of progressives that they seek to divert attention from intelligent debate of the issue onto who's offended and who's not very nice. Lucas further claimed that it was most likely true that a sex education in Scotland would be indoctrinating children into LGBT ideology because that is government policy. He said the Scottish Family Party supports sex education as long as it is not vulgar and corrupting. So just to conclude, I am sceptical about some of the stories that have been included in this article, that people have been driven out of teaching. I'm very, very sceptical indeed. I think sometimes people's hostility towards paedophilia does become irrational, does become ugly. In some ways, the classic situations in prison, where the paedophile gets beaten up by the two mass murderers who feel, at least I'm not a paedophile. Things are obviously unbalanced in that situation. On the other hand, the hostility and revulsion towards paedophilia that does exist in our society, sometimes it gets out of control, sometimes it gets misapplied, but at the end of the day, it is something that we need, because it's going to be vital in defending the innocence of our children in the future.